workshop. I also want to acknowledge that I am coming here to you from Ottawa in the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe. I want to acknowledge the historical struggles that our Indigenous peoples have gone through, and I want to encourage us to reflect on those situations and to appreciate and welcome everyone's contribution. So, as we remember the past and we try not to reproduce the same errors, we also need to welcome everyone. And so, that's what I'd like all of us to take a moment to do today. So this workshop, so how to use the Government of Canada Workplace Accessibility Passport. The passport is an initiative funded through the Centralized Enabling Workplace Fund at the Treasury Board of Canada Secretariat. It is uh, providing a way to facilitate, improve, and streamline workplace accommodation. So our workshop hopefully will answer many of your questions and give you some practical examples as well of how to use the passport. We will divide this workshop in 3 segments. Part one, with a conversation on the how to use the passport. We will answer some key questions, context, and why and how. Second portion, we will have two scenarios, two real life situations actually, but described as examples that illustrate how to have a conversation about workplace accommodation and how to use the passport. And the third portion of this workshop, we will answer additional questions, particularly around privacy, signature, transfer of the passport as well. We will end this workshop, and if our workshop in French this morning is an example, we had ample time for questions and answers that you can put in the chat section, and we will answer as many questions as we can. We will follow this workshop with an email including resources, documents, and links, as well as answers to questions. So without further ado, I will turn to my colleague Clara Morgan, who is currently acting as the director of the Centralized Enabling Workplace Fund, which is responsible for the Passport Initiative. Welcome, Clara.
Hello, good afternoon or good noon, perhaps for some people. So glad to be here with you, Luna, to talk about this amazing tool called the Passport, the GC Workplace Accessibility Passport. Shall we get started with all my questions?
Let's get started. And you can perhaps, use your imagination and picture Clara and me sitting around the table having a great conversation about what a wonderful tool. Go ahead, Clara.
Yes, and I just got my coffee, so this is fantastic. Luna, I'd really want to start with the Accessible Canada Act, which came into effect in 2019. Can you tell me a little bit more about the importance of the Accessible Canada Act to the work we're doing on the passport?
Definitely. So the Accessible Canada Act, as everyone knows, is an important piece of legislation. What I wanted to bring to your attention this afternoon is some really important aspects of the act that relate to workplace accommodation and the passport. The first one is that the Accessible Canada Act has a very broad definition of what disability is. It is a definition that encompasses physical, mental, cognitive, learning, sensory, and also permanent, episodic, or temporary. So it's a very, very, very broad definition. And we know that disability is the one thing that does not discriminate. It can happen to anyone at any point, and that's what the Accessible Canada Act recognizes. The second important point is that the Accessible Canada Act is shifting the responsibility from the individual to put it more on the organizations that have a responsibility and a role in proactively eliminating barriers to the full participation of persons with disabilities, particularly in the area of employment, not just unemployment, but definitely in that area. The third point is nothing without us. So, nothing without us is an important principle that recognizes that people with disabilities can be and should be at the center of any discussion and action that is going to affect us. So, what that means is basically people with disabilities should be part of the conversation at any point, and especially in the context of work and workplace accommodation. And last but not least, just to remind us all that every organization in the federal public service that is subject to the Accessible Canada Act, so as the Government of Canada, we are subject to the ACA, and every organization has to submit an accessibility plan by December 2022. Just a reminder that this is October 19th, so not much time left. The clock is ticking, and by December 2022, we should see those accessibility plans published. And hopefully, this is the beginning of very concerted action to address barriers faced by people with disabilities.
Thank you, Luna. And often I know that I've heard you say that accessibility is not a destination, but a journey. Can you tell us a little bit more of how you conceptualize workplace accommodations as part of this journey?
Definitely. Yes, it is a journey, and it is a journey that really may take a long time in certain cases, and yet we have lots of progress already. But in terms of workplace accommodations is part of a I guess a continuum of things that need to happen for people with disabilities to fully participate in the workplace. The first element is the environment, making sure that our environment is free of obstacles. And obstacles are really not just physical obstacles, they're obstacles to participation by anyone, including things like, of course, the physical environment, but also communications and information technology. It is about creating an environment at work that supports people with different requirements. It is about eliminating barriers, doing everything we can to make sure that we create that welcoming environment. In addition to that, of course, there's culture, and it's a culture that values people for their contribution, that looks at people, as unique individuals that can bring a really good contribution in the workplace. So, treating people with respect, eliminating situations of harassment and discrimination. But even more than that, it's being creating that positive culture that is going to make everybody feel valued and give them an opportunity to thrive. And of course, last but not least, and most importantly, even within a very accessible environment and a very welcoming culture, many people with disabilities are going to need individual adjustments, individual accommodations. For some, it may be a sit stand desk. For others, it may be quiet space. For someone else, it might be a list of tasks that is described and communicated. For others, it's adaptive technology, a screen reader, magnification, etc. So really, there's a variety of solutions and individual adjustments that are going to enable everyone to succeed.
Thanks for that, Luna, for that explanation. And there's another point that I'd like to ask you about. I know that often we talk about a yes by default approach to obtaining the necessary accommodations in the workplace. But does yes by default mean yes to everything the employee asks for? Could you please clarify?
Well, yes by default is really um, it describes in very short in a very short sentence what our legislation and policies express. So in Canada, we have a strong human rights and employment equity legal framework. We have now the Accessible Canada Act. And what these legislation and policies say is basically that every employee is entitled to request the measures or the tools that they need to be successful in the workplace. It means that managers and organizations have a responsibility to look at every request, to examine every request, and to action it as quickly as possible when they deem that it is a reasonable request. And the word reasonable, of course, it's subject to interpretation. But let's remember that it is up to the organization and therefore the manager who is the face of that organization to really they would really have to explain why they thought a request was not reasonable. So uh, it is we are here to encourage people to come forward and make their requests. We are there to encourage managers to take an open and positive approach to requests for workplace accommodations. And as you said in your question, Clara, this doesn't mean yes to everything, but it definitely is a good opportunity to have an open discussion about it.
And we know that the passport helps us in many different ways. It helps us by having the manager able to approach the employee to explain, so the employee has an opportunity to explain how they work in the workplace and what barriers and solutions they face in the workplace. And it forms the basis for an open dialogue between both the employee and manager. As well, it helps both parties come to an understanding of getting to yes. And I wanted you to explain a little bit more, Luna, about how you see the passport as part of that conversation with the manager, and then how a passport is designed to capture that vision of situation barriers and solutions as well.
Yes, thank you, Clara. You've summarized it really well because when we are talking about a manager that needs to open to considering the request and open to really explore solutions with the employee, that's exactly what we mean. And that's where the passport comes in. A passport is a tool, it's a document, it's a relatively simple document that belongs to the employee, that enables the employee to explain to the manager, this is how I function. Therefore, these are either the tools or the measures that I need to be able to do the best job that I can do. And it is a way for the manager to understand, to have that conversation, to understand how it will work, and to have that open dialogue. Because let's not forget the main responsibility of a manager is to ask the very simple question. how can I best support you as my employee, as a member of my team, so we can do the best work that we can to deliver on our mandate. So therefore, with the employee being able to explain what barriers they face and if they know what solution they're looking for, with the manager having that openness to consider the tools and the measures and to implement them promptly and without too much process, if at all possible. That's how you get to that famous yes that we are talking about. That's how you get to a passport agreement. And the passport documents that agreement between the two parties to implement the solutions that have been identified.
Thank you, Luna. We're having such a good conversation, and I'm keeping a track of the chat, and there's some really good questions arising among our participants. Maybe we could sort of start a little bit addressing these questions as part of our conversation. I know I get this question often about medical documentation, and you know how we tried so hard in the passport agreement in the instructions to let people know that no medical information is required. So how do we address that when, most of us as managers do request are trained to request medical documentation under the duty to accommodate? Could you elaborate a little bit more on what is required as
Of
part of the
course,
passport? Thank
of
you.
course. I think that's a really frequent question. You're absolutely right. Maybe just say that the passport is about the situation at work. So whether it's I have to work on site, I work in an office environment versus I work on a ship at Fisheries and Oceans or the Coast Guard, or it really needs to take into consideration the work situation and the job responsibilities. It isn't about the medical condition. It isn't about a diagnosis or a treatment. It is about the workplace. So, what do we need to do in the workplace to address the barriers that the employee may face? And barriers may be due to a lot of things. They may be due to systems that the person cannot use. It may be due to the fact that they don't have the adaptive technology that they need in order to access, for example, documents or applications. It may be due to the fact that they don't have a setup that is conducive to them being able to work, perhaps because there's too much noise in the workplace or too much light stimulation, etc. Those are the barriers. And then we are talking about solutions, and solutions are those kinds of measures or tools that are going to enable the employee to overcome these barriers and to be able to do their job. So, why are we saying medical documentation is not what we're looking for? Because what we're looking for with the passport and the model that the passport is really promoting is, in case that the employee and the manager either cannot agree on the solutions or don't know what the solutions are, is an assessment of the situation and recommendations from people who are recognized for their expertise in understanding workplace accommodations. Those aren't generally doctors. They're more psychological psychologists. They're more occupational therapists. They are workplace accommodations experts that are in several areas of the federal public service, including our colleagues from the adaptive accessibility accommodation and adaptive computer technology program at SSC, who provide a broad range of expertise. So they are probably present within many organizations as well. Those are the kinds of professionals that can look at the job can look at the barriers and can propose and identify solutions. So requesting a medical note every year, that's really, first of all, burdensome, not just on the employee and the manager and the organization, but also on healthcare services that are already very taxed for all kinds of other reasons.
Thanks, Luna. Yes, and we've heard so many times from our persons with disabilities community that they have to continuously prove their disability. And what we're trying to do here is move away from a model that asks for medical documentation to prove a disability, but for a model that allows us to provide barriers as an explanation on how employees interact with the environment. And so I've put the definition of barriers in the chat.
Excellent.
So thanks for that. I wanted to sort of address also if an organization is trying to find a pathway for integrating the passport into their workplace accommodation processes and into the conversation employees and managers have. What would be that pathway? How would we go about integrating the passport?
Yes, thanks, Clara. First of all, we have to have a goal of simplifying the process because, as we know, things tend to take a long time. They become very complex. There's a lot of administrative steps that have to be completed in order for in the end, the individual to have access to the accommodations that they need. So our goal has to be to simplify the process. And we need to start with a passport because the passport is really where it starts. It's where we start to think about the work situation, where we start to think about the barriers we are facing, and then where we can start having those conversations about the solutions that are best going to address these barriers, whether we know which ones they are or not. So, in a very simple, sort of very linear path, you would start with thinking about the work situation as an employee, describing the barriers that you may face at work, and then identifying solutions if you've already had accommodations before, or if you know what the best solutions are. And then have the conversation with the manager because the manager needs to know. They are not going to guess what is going to work best for you as an employee. So the manager needs to know and have that conversation and then come to an agreement. And if we're able to come to that agreement in a simple scenario, as we will see in a little bit with our first scenario, then hey, we have resolved the issue in a timely manner and in a simplified manner. It may be that we don't know, that the employee doesn't know what solutions work for them. It may be that the manager isn't sure and would like some advice. All those kinds of situations. In that case, our path with the passport is to make sure that with the employee's consent and with the employee being aware that we bring other expertise into the discussion in order to identify the best solutions for the employee at work. So if that's the case, then as our second scenario will illustrate, you and a specialist can provide some advice again, and then to get back to a discussion with the manager and an agreement on what will be put in place. The passport is not the end. It's definitely, but it should be the trigger for any action to implement what was agreed to. So, for example, if there's something that needs to be purchased, if there are measures to be put in place, then the manager with generally with HR or other key corporate players like IT or facilities will work to implement the solutions as quickly as possible. So that's in a nutshell a bit of the description.
This is really good, really helpful. And I just wanted to ask you, Luna, I know we get this question often. Do I need the approval of my manager when I have a passport? I completed my passport, I have the barriers, I have the solution. Do I need their approval? What is the role of the manager?
So the manager has a very, of course, a very key role in supporting the employee, first of all. So they support the employee by having the conversation, by discussing the passport, by coming to an agreement with the employee. So the passport is an agreement. It's not a document for approval. It's an agreement between two parties. Once the agreement is there, then the role of the manager is to ensure there's action, to ensure the tools or measures are purchased or implemented according to the agreement. And the role of the manager is to be there to ensure that that takes place and to check back with the employee to see that things are working and to once the solutions have been implemented and to check on a regular basis to make sure that things are still working well. So that there's those are key roles for managers. Now, there may be approvals required, of course, if the solutions include um, equipment or devices that need to be purchased, if they include services that need to be paid for, if so, basically, if there are implications that require delegated financial authority, in that case, approvals will be needed as per departmental procedures.
Thanks, Luna. And I see that it's 1:59 and it's
Mhm.
time to transition. This has been really, really good discussion, and I look forward to having the Q's and A's with you. There's a lot of good questions. I just want to reiterate to the participants that we will be capturing all the questions if we don't get to them at the end, and have a Q's and A distributed to you all that will provide you with your valuable answers to your valuable questions. So hand it over to you, Luna, for the next segment.
Thanks, Clara. Absolutely. We'll have, I want to direct people to canada.ca, where there are pages with resources on the passport, including the passport document itself that you can download. The other place where you can find information is on GCpedia, and we'll send all the links in our follow-up email. So we're going to move to our second segment of this workshop, and here where our examples are. So we're going to see two scenarios of workplace accommodation where you're going to see a manager and employee and a description of the situation and how the passport is being used in these two different situations. So I am going to introduce our manager, Dana, and our first employee who is here to have a conversation with Dana, and that's Elizabeth. So Dana and Elizabeth are going to present to you their scenario, and we will have an opportunity to recap after their scenario. Go ahead.
Welcome aboard, Elizabeth. I'm looking forward to having our conversation today. And please bear with me as I have a bit of a cold. I'm a bit congested. There's some bugs going around. So I wonder if you might have noticed that HR mentioned the GC Workplace Accessibility Passport in your letter of offer. In case you're unfamiliar, the passport is a tool where you can document your workplace barriers and accommodation solutions. If you need to and haven't already, I'd encourage you to complete the passport to help make the work environment as welcoming as possible for you.
Thank you, Dana. I am actually familiar with the Accessibility Passport. It's great that the tool exists to support the accommodation process. Actually, I've already started filling out my passport, and I was really hoping we'd have a conversation with you about the accommodation measures that I need.
Yeah, that sounds great. If you're comfortable, why don't you pull up whatever you have so far so that we can review it together?
Great. I filled out the first section with my general information, and in section 2, I've laid out my barriers and solutions. The definitions contained in the document were really helpful for me to figure out exactly what my barriers and solutions are and how to fill out this section. My first barrier is related to the physical work environment. Distractions in the workplace make it difficult for me to focus on my work. I've proposed 2 solutions for this barrier in my passport. First, I'd like to be able to build focus time into my schedule. And during that focus time, I'd really like to have access to quiet workspaces.
Yeah. So in the past, Elizabeth, have you been able to access these accommodations?
Yes, I did. In my previous job, my manager had agreed that I could schedule focus time and help me to book regular quiet spaces. I've documented this in the passport as well for you.
That's great. Okay, I'd be happy to support you in implementing those solutions here.
I'm really happy to hear that. The second barrier I wanted to talk about that I've documented in the passport is related to workplace communication and task management. When my tasks are not clearly defined, I find it challenging to complete them in a timely manner. The first solution I've proposed to this barrier is to have weekly touch base meetings with you to define my priorities. The second solution I proposed is that I be provided with a written tasking rather than verbal ones. In my previous position, my manager had weekly meetings with me to define my priorities and would often, but not always, list my priorities in writing for me.
These are actually solutions I've implemented with other members of the team, so there'll be no problem making this happen for you too.
That's good to know. In the next section of the passport, I've provided contact information for my previous manager. I'm comfortable with you contacting them for further information on solutions that have worked out for me in the past. Here in section 3, I've attached the sections of my psychological and audiological assessments that document the barriers they identified.
Okay. And I see all your solutions are documented in section 4. That's awesome. Thanks for walking me through this document, Elizabeth. I look forward to receiving and signing it with you when you're ready. And you know, in about 6 months, or if ever circumstances were to change, we can have another discussion to make sure that your solutions are still working. And together we can determine if there's anything that needs to be adjusted.
That's great, Dana. I really look forward to working with you and the team. Thank you.
So thank you so much, Dana and Elizabeth. You have illustrated a very simple and smooth conversation about workplace accommodations where we have a very collaborative approach to the situation. And let me introduce our participants to who you are in real life. So Dana Kenny is an analyst with the Office of Public Service Accessibility, part of the policy and engagement team. And Elizabeth Ellis is leading the implementation of a shared workplace accommodation center at Treasury Board Secretariat, along with the Department of Finance, I believe, right? So Elizabeth Ellis and Dana Kenny, thank you so much for lending your presence to the scenario. And we are sharing these scenarios with you, and we will resend them as well in our follow-up email, so you can have access to it. And now we keep Dana as our manager. And you're our manager du jour, Dana, and we are welcoming Victoria, who is here as Dana's new employee, as well as I believe Marlene is with us, and Marlene is going to be our workplace accommodation specialist. So in this scenario, which is a little bit more complex, you'll see there are different conversations that are depicted because there's a progression in the discussion, and so we'll have a couple of conversations in order to get to our conclusion. So Dana and Victoria and Marlene, take it away. Thank you.
Hi, Dana. I was hoping to Thank you for the meeting that you had with me. Last week, I shared my completed passport with you, and I was hoping we could use this conversation to figure out what accommodation measures could be in place to help support my work.
Yeah, absolutely, Victoria. I'm glad we're having this conversation, and I want to ensure that our work environment is accessible for you and everyone in the lab.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. As I outlined in my passport, there are several inaccessible features in the lab that we should address. First, I face a barrier in reaching and opening cabinets to access the equipment that I need to do my job. The cabinet doors are quite heavy, and the cabinet shelves themselves are quite high on the wall and hard to reach. So, the second barrier that I had identified is the lack of adjustable workstations in the lab. My desk is quite narrow and not height adjustable, so navigating the lab and manipulating the equipment is therefore very difficult.
Yeah, this building is quite old. I think it's older than both of us. So it's not surprising that you're facing these barriers to the built environment. And we've never had an employee who's needed these type of adjustments. But before we discuss some solutions, I wonder, can you tell me if you faced similar barriers in the past and what measures worked for you?
Well, Dana, my previous lab was relatively new, so it came equipped with many accessibility features built in. In most labs, at least one, if not all workstations were equipped with adjustable desks that were wide enough for wheelchair access. And in that job, I didn't use the shelving much, so I don't really have a solution in mind for that barrier here.
Okay, yeah. Well, those solutions that could be applied, they do sound great. I think we'll need to bring in a workplace accommodation expert to collaborate with us a bit and find some solutions to the shelf and the cabinet issues. Let's start by setting up a meeting with a workplace accommodation specialist, and I'll send an invitation to the both of you to share information about your needs in advance of the meeting.
So, with the employee's consent, the passport is shared with the workplace accommodation specialist for consultation. Both the employee and the manager attend a meeting with the workplace accommodation specialist to discuss solutions.
There are several solutions to your shelving problem. My first suggestion is to build tiered cabinet shelving throughout the lab. With tiered shelves, employees can keep equipment at a shelf height that is accessible to them. I also recommend removing all non-essential cabinet doors for easy access to equipment. For equipment that needs to be kept in cabinets, the doors will need to be retrofitted to a lighter material and fitted to automatically open when pushed lightly on the corners.
Oh, Marlene, these solutions sound really great, and I think they'll eliminate some of the barriers that I'm facing.
I agree, Marlene. Thank you for these solutions. I've taken some notes. I might follow up with you, but I'm going to bring these to our building management team along with other solutions we've discussed, Victoria. And together, hopefully, we'll take well, not hopefully, we're going to take the necessary steps to purchase the equipment and have them installed.
The manager and the employee review and sign the passport agreement, and the manager informs the employee of progress with the implementation of the solutions. After 3 months, and all the employees' accommodation have been purchased and implemented.
Hi, Victoria. I'd like to have a little chat about how your accommodation measures are working out so far.
Oh, Dana, it is so much easier to do my work now, and I feel like I can work in the lab much more independently. I've also found that I complete my experiments and reports in a much more timely fashion. I feel so much more productive in this workspace than I did before.
I'm so glad to hear that. How about we schedule another check-in though for 6 months from now to make sure that all these solutions are still working for you. And if there's anything to change in the meantime and you find you're facing new barriers or require solutions or perhaps adjustments to existing solutions, don't hesitate to reach out to me so that we can review your passport together.
That sounds great, Dana. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Dana, our manager, Victoria, our employee, and Marlene, our workplace accommodation specialist, and in the role of the narrator transition, Adiki Puplampo, our colleague, part of the Passport team. So let me reintroduce Dana. Dana Kenny is an analyst with the engagement policy and engagement team at the Office of Public Service Accessibility. Victoria works at Labor Canada, and she's also a very active member of the Knowledge Circle for Indigenous Employees with Disabilities. Victoria, it's wonderful to have you. Marlene is what she is in reality, a workplace accommodation specialist at the Accessibility, Accommodation, and Adaptive Computer Technology Program at Shared Services Canada. Thank you to all of you. You have depicted a scenario that's a little bit more complex, that really requires a little more time in terms of finding the right solutions. And of course, after this agreement and these conversations, there's always the importance of being able to procure the equipment, to make sure that things are set up and implemented in a timely manner. Because of course, every day that the employee cannot do their work comfortably and properly and safely is a day that the employee is not contributing to the team and to the mandate of the organization. So it is critical to expedite workplace accommodations. And thank you so much for for sharing with us these two scenarios. And we are now at part 3 of this workshop. And in this part, we are going to answer some important questions about the passport itself. So the passport agreement, what do we do with it? How do we share it? And for that, I am pleased to welcome Ashley Eads, one of our colleagues on the passport team, and Missy Madeline Thomas, one of our wonderful students, again, as part of the passport teams, who are going to answer some questions for us. So I want to start by asking the very basic question. I have a passport. I have completed my passport or parts of it. How do I store it? How do I keep it? And just a reminder that the passport is a Word document.
Yeah. So then, as you said, Luna, once you've completed the passport, you should store it in an easy to find Microsoft Word document. For instance, you can keep a copy on your personal computer. And as others have already mentioned, it's up to you to be able to share that passport, this Word document, with your manager. And it cannot be copied or shared without your consent. And then once you've completed the passport, we recommend reviewing it every 6 months or so, or as your circumstances change.
Thank you, Missy. It is really important to remember that the passport does belong to the employee. So another question is, how do I share my passport? Who do I share it with? Do I have to? And anything that you can tell us about sharing the passport? Ashley?
As
Are
the
we?
employee, yeah,
Yeah.
sorry, took me a
It's okay.
second to unmute. I apologize.
No
As
problem.
the employee, you own the information contained in the passport, so you can decide who has permission to see it. You can choose to fill out the passport and keep it as a personal record and not share it with your manager, or you can fill it out and decide to share it with your manager later. As an employee, you control the information and what to do with it. This also means that when you move to a new job, you can decide if or when to share the information in the passport with your new manager. Also, because you own the passport, it does not require any approval. Together, you and your manager sign the passport as a record of the agreement to provide you with the adaptive tools or support measures.
Thank you, Ashley. I think it's a really important thing, and really a few reminders. It is not mandatory to complete a passport. It's really up to the employee. We, of course, strongly encourage any employee who requires workplace accommodations to complete the passport and to have, most importantly, to have the conversation with the manager, because a manager isn't necessarily going to guess that you need workplace accommodations, let alone determining what solutions are going to best work for you. So that's why as much as possible, we encourage employees to complete and share their passport. However, you can use it as a tool to think, to reflect on the barriers that you encounter, to think through what solutions would be best for you, and you may decide to share it at a later date. So another important question is, and we dealt with this earlier in this workshop, is what do I need an approval? Does the passport need to be approved? Who wants to take this question?
Yeah, I'll take my best at it, and Linda, you can continue. The passport does not need to be improved. The employee owns it and can put what they want in it, but it's also the start of a conversation with the manager about getting solutions that will work for the employee and help them be at their best.
Great. Excellent. Thank you, Misty. Ashley, I'm going to turn to you for the last words in this segment. Tell us more about the passport and about privacy and about also the need, any need for documentation and what happens when I change jobs or when I change manager.
For sure. So, as Luna, you mentioned earlier, the employee owns the passport, and yes, it is voluntary. So, you decide when to share any of the information in the passport with your new manager if you change jobs. And to keep in mind, one of the objectives of the passport is to help facilitate mobility of employees among public service organizations. And it can provide a starting point for a conversation about barriers and solutions either with your new manager or as circumstances change.
Thank you. It is important to keep the passport up to date, as both Ashley and Missy have mentioned. And perhaps I'll end before we move to the many questions and comments. I can hear my phone dinging with comments and questions in the chat constantly. So before we turn to those, I want to talk about self-identification. I think we said earlier, many of us have said earlier in this workshop that the passport is owned by the employee and it is a voluntary action on their part to document their barriers and solutions. It also is, you aren't required to self-identify in order to create or complete a passport. You're and conversely, if you decide to self-identify, it doesn't mean that that's automatically going to lead to getting or requesting the accommodations that you need. So you will need to complete a passport to start that conversation with your manager and within your organizations. And there'll be lots more to come on the topic of self-ID in the coming weeks. So please stay tuned. And again, before we move on to the questions section, I would encourage everyone to visit our passportcanada.ca page and to visit our GCpedia page for many resources on the passport, including some videos, the passport document itself, and as well as guides. And now I am going to go back to Clara, who is going to lead us to the questions and the comments from our participants.